Okay, we are continuing with our study on the life and the ministry of the Apostle Paul. Last week we left off and Paul was in Ephesus. We'd gotten down to the point, we'd gotten down into about verse 23 of Acts chapter 19, where something happened that caused him some grief that we'll work on this morning and then move on from there. Just to bring you back up to speed again, shortly before this, he had just sent Titus on to Corinth with the first letter to the Corinthians, and he had sent Timothy and Erastus into Macedonia. The idea was that, remember that one of the purposes of this third missionary trip was for him to collect the funds that had been raised by the different churches so that he could carry that collection back to Jerusalem. That was one of the main reasons for this. Not only to strengthen the brethren, but also to collect the funds to take to Jerusalem. So he sent Timothy and Erastus on ahead so that those people in those various churches would know that he's coming. He's right behind them, so get it together so that when he gets here, we don't have to make it up then. You've already got it, and he's going to collect it and then carry it on back to Jerusalem. So he sends them on ahead. And then something happens that we read about here in between verses 23 and 24 of Acts chapter 19. It says, at the same time there arose no small stir about that way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver shrines for Diana, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen. Now, Demetrius it says he's a silversmith. They had these little silver temple-looking things that you could open the doors on, and Diana would be on the inside. And they sold these to people that would come visit. Ephesus was a place where people would travel. It was on a seaport. They would go there, and and those that worshiped Diana would want to go home with one of these little temple-looking things, and other people would buy them for souvenirs. Just like if you travel somewhere and you end up in one of these other countries, you end up grabbing some little trinket to take home with you. And these guys made a lot of money selling these little silver temple-looking things. That's what he did for a living, and he made a lot of money at it. Verse 25 says, whom he called together with workmen of like occupation and said, sirs, you know that by this craft we have our wealth. Moreover, you see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that there be no gods which are made with hands. So that not only this our craft is in danger to be set at naught, but also that the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worshipeth. Now notice what his main concern here, quite frankly, is he's going to lose his job. I'm not going to be able to make the kind of money I'm making if this guy keeps preaching that Diana doesn't amount to anything. If he starts convincing people that Diana's not really a goddess, I'm going to lose money. That's his main motivation, okay? And when they heard these sayings, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, great is Diana of the Ephesians. And the whole city was filled with confusion. And having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. Now, I'm sure that they were looking for the Apostle Paul. Couldn't find him. So they grabbed Gaius, and they grabbed Aristarchus, and they hauled him into the theater. Now, the theater is the place where the gladiators would have their games. That's what the theater was for, primarily. They would fight lions in the theater. And so the idea being that we'll drag these people in here and we'll make them fight the lions. That was the punishment for blaspheming against the great goddess Diana. Okay? And Paul would have entered unto the people. The disciples suffered him not. Paul wanted to go help these guys, and they wouldn't let him go. And certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, sent unto him, desiring him that he would not adventure himself into the theater. Don't go down there. Some therefore cried one thing, and some another, for the assembly was confused, and the more part knew not wherefore they were come together. You know, this is what happens when you get into one of these mobs. You got some people that are there for one reason, and other people that are there for another reason, and they're all shouting something different. They don't even know why they're there. They just get caught up in the emotion of it all and drugged down the street, and they don't even know why. These things get completely out of hand. Go watch. We got them all going on all over the country right now. All you got to do is take a look at them. And there are people there for all different reasons. And most of them don't even know why. They don't even know what started it. When in reality, what started it here was a silversmith was afraid he was going to lose his business. And so a riot ensues. Okay, verse 33, and they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. Now, Alexander was a Jew. And the Jews put him, but because, you see, the idolaters were not just against Christians. They were also against Jews, because the Jews taught the same things relative to idolatry that the Christians taught. So when the Jews put Alexander forward, well, that's not going to sell, because they see him in the same light, right? The friend of my, what's that old saying? The friend of my enemy is my friend, or what? So, or the however that works out. So here you've got the Jew, even though he's not in line with the Christian, he's still against the idolaters. So the Jews put him out there. And Alexander beckoned with the hand and would have made his defense unto the people, but when they knew that he was a Jew, all with one voice about the space of 2 hours cried out, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. So they start screaming for 2 hours. 2 hours. The city's in an uproar over something that Demetrius caused because he didn't want to lose his business. And when the town's clerk had appeased the people, he said, Ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that knoweth not how the city of the Ephesians is a worshiper of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Jupiter? Seeing then that these things cannot be spoken against, ye ought to be quiet and to do nothing rashly. In other words, knock it off, quiet down. You're arguing over something that there's no reason to get into this tumult over this. For ye have brought hither these men, which are neither robbers. Gaius and Aristarchus hadn't done anything wrong. They hadn't stolen anything from anybody. They're not robbers. They haven't robbed a church. They're not blasphemers. They haven't done anything. And you drag them to the theater. Wherefore, if Demetrius and the craftsmen which are with him have a matter against any man, the law is open. If Demetrius has an issue against Paul, let him take it to the courts. That's what courts are for. Sue him at the law and take him to the courts. You see, this guy is arguing from the standpoint of, we're civilized here. We're not barbarians. We have a court system. And they had a court system. So Demetrius, if you think that he's harming your business, then sue him and take him to the court. Right? That's a reasonable thing to say. If Demetrius and the craftsmen which are with him have a matter against any man, the law is open, and there are deputies, let them implead one another. But if you acquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. And here's the reason. For we are in danger to be called in question for this day's uproar, there being no cause whereby we may give an account of this concourse. Ephesus was a Roman colony. And if you get out of line like this, the Romans want to know why. Mr. Governor, why are you not controlling your city? It's a shame we don't have people today that do that here. You see, the people that are rioting now, they have no fear of the law. Back then, they feared the Romans. They knew the Romans could come and they'd put a stop to this. They wouldn't tolerate this kind of stuff. And that's the argument he's making. We're in danger to be called in question for this day's uproar. There's no reason for this. And when he had thus spoken, he dismissed the assembly and he let them go. So backtracking, we have Demetrius, who is a man of considerable influence. He could see the writing on the wall that spreading the gospel was going to hurt him financially. So he got this riot started, hoping that they could rid themselves of Paul and rid themselves of this gospel. And while Paul wanted to go down and help, they talked him out of it. Anyway, the riot lasted. They finally got it quelled because of the fear of the Romans, and that ends the riot. Now, there's a couple of other things I want to mention before we move on from Ephesus. That was the final thing that happened at Ephesus, was that riot. Something else that Paul did, he wrote the letter to the Galatians during his time in Ephesus. That's one of the letters that he wrote. He had written he wrote the letters to the Corinthians, the first letter to the Corinthians, and he also wrote the letter to the Galatians during this time. And the object of the letter to the Galatians is to put them on guard regarding those false teachers and seducers that had appeared in Galatia to challenge Paul's position. They reviled Paul. You can tell that by reading the letter. They had persuaded the Galatians to submit to the rite of circumcision, to bring themselves under the Mosaic law, including the observance of the festivals, which were never intended to be observed by Gentiles and never intended to be observed outside of Palestine. Those are things that were supposed to take place at the temple, but these Judaizers had convinced the Galatians, those Gauls, that they should do the same. So Paul writes the letter first to vindicate his own character as an apostle, showing that he was in no respect inferior to Peter. Peter was an apostle to the Jews. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. The Galatians are Gentiles. And Paul's standing is equal with Peter when it comes to the standpoint of being an apostle. So don't listen to the Jew side on this. You're not Jewish. Listen to the apostle that was sent to you. He shows the unprofitable nature of those observances. He exhorts them to preserve in the course they'd begun. And he concludes with a lot of precepts relative to how they should live their lives as Christians. Now, I mentioned when we were talking about some of the other letters that the postscript on these letters says something. I mean, if you look at the letter to the Galatians, I think it says he wrote it from Rome. Let me look real quick. I think that's what it says. Yeah, under the Galatians, written from Rome. And I've made the point that, you know what, those postscripts, depending on what version you look at, even ancient versions, if you look at at some of the other ancient versions, they decide whatever they decide. That's an opinion. That's not inspired. The postscript's not inspired. there's a couple of points that tend to make me believe that he wrote this letter from Ephesus. In one respect, it is the only epistle that he ever wrote fully by his own hand. That he actually sat down and wrote this letter by himself. He didn't use a secretary like he had in others. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 11, it says, "You see how large a letter I have written unto you with mine own hand." You're not going to find that in any of the other epistles. The other epistles, for the most part, were written by somebody else. You remember the Romans letter as an example. When we went through the study on the book of Romans, when we got down to Romans chapter 16, I think it is, see where it is. Of course, I can't find it when I'm looking for it. Romans 16:22, "I, Tertius, who wrote this epistle, salute you in the Lord." That was his secretary. And I explained to you that many times, in most cases, the Holy Spirit would give the apostle the words. He would speak the words, someone else would write the words down. In this case, it was this Tertius character. When it came to Galatians, Paul wrote it himself. And there's something else I want to point out, and that is when he starts off in Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, he says, "I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel." That you are so soon. The word "so" gives emphasis to the word that follows. Okay? Like if I were to say, well, you are so right. Okay, that gives emphasis to the fact that you're right. You're so late. That means you're really late. It gives emphasis to the fact that you're late. Okay? Here he says, you are so soon departed. When did Paul finally end up in Rome? Think about this with me for a minute. He left Galatia and went to Ephesus. He spent 3 years in the city of Ephesus. He then went into Macedonia and then into Corinth, spent 3 months in Corinth, then retraced his steps, went all the way back through Macedonia into Troas, across the sea into Troas again, down to Miletus, then finally sailed into Jerusalem. Okay, or had some stops along the way, which I hope we'll get there today, where he gets into Jerusalem. Gets to Jerusalem, he gets arrested. He spends months in Jerusalem, then goes to Caesarea, spends 2 years in prison in Caesarea, then from there makes a journey, gets shipwrecked, has to walk across an island, catch another boat to finally get to Rome. Is that so soon? 6, 7, 8 years after he left Galatia, that's so soon that they departed? That doesn't seem so soon to me. But if he wrote the letter from Ephesus, that makes sense. Because he leaves Galatia and goes to Ephesus, and during his 3 years in Ephesus, he gets word that Galatia's already starting to flip out on you. So he writes a letter and says, I marvel that you are so soon departed from the grace. That makes sense to me, but not Rome. Because he didn't get to Rome for another 6 or 7 years, and that's not soon. You think about it, this church has been here, I've been down here for 7.5 years, so was it so soon from the time that, I mean, were you all baptized just like a week ago? Was that really quick? No, you've been in the church now for 8 years. That's not so soon. And it would be the same type of a thing if he didn't write this letter until he made it all the way to Rome. But if he wrote it from Ephesus, it makes perfect sense that he said so soon. Okay. Now, there's something else I want to cover. And that is something that is said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. First Corinthians 15 and verse 32, where the Apostle Paul says, "If after the manner of men I have fought with beasts at Ephesus, what advantageth it me if the dead rise not?" Now there are quite a few early church fathers and commentators that take this to mean that Paul actually fought lions in the theater at Ephesus. I don't take it that way, and I'm going to give you my reasons for why I don't take it that way. But there are many that take that verse to mean that when he wrote to the Corinthians, that what he was saying here was that he had actually fought with lions. Now, let me say this. If he did fight with lions and I get up there and I find out, I'm going to apologize to him for taking the position. And I do understand that God could protect him from fighting with lions, just like he did with Daniel. When Daniel was thrown in the lion's den, God can protect him from doing that. I just don't think he did. And here's my reasons why. Let's define our terms. A beast is any four-footed animal which may be used for labor, food, or sport, distinguished from fowls, insects, fishes, and man. Opposed to man, it signifies any irrational animal, as in the phrase man and beast. So that would be a wild beast. And figuratively, a brutal man, a person rude, coarse, filthy, or acting in a manner unworthy of a rational creature. So if we look at the primary definition, we're looking at a beast, an animal. If we look at the secondary definition, we're looking at men that might as well be beasts. Okay? We generally look at things from a standpoint of a primary meaning. I'm thinking in this instance, that this is one of those times where we have to look at it from a secondary standpoint. That word manner, just so you know, the word manner, that if after the manner of men, if you go back into the Greek and look at that, you'll find out that word can also mean intention. That after the intention of men I fought with beasts. Okay? That helps to clear it up some. I'm thinking what he's saying here is somewhat metaphorical. In other words, that if after the manner of men I have fought with beasts at Ephesus, what advantageth it me if the dead rise not? The point that he's making here is the resurrection. If there's no resurrection, then whatever I do down here, whether I fight with beasts or not, what difference does it make? What good is it if I go so far as to fight lions if the dead don't rise? If I go fight somebody and get killed as a result of it, well, what good is that if I don't rise from the dead? What would be the point? Okay? Now, some contend that the beasts in question are the men at Ephesus that had treated him so harshly. Here's my reasoning for believing that this is more metaphorical than literal. Okay? For one thing, Luke never mentions it. You're not going to find it in the Acts of the Apostles. You're not going to find it anywhere but in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 32. Luke never brings it up. Never mentions the idea of Paul ever being in a theater fighting lions. It's never mentioned. Okay? Second, Paul was a Roman citizen, and that form of punishment was illegal for Roman citizens. There are certain things that you benefit from as being a Roman citizen in a Roman colony. One of which is you don't get turned into a gladiator and thrown into the arena with lions. That didn't happen. That was another one. You can't be crucified. The Apostle Paul wasn't crucified because he was a Roman citizen. He was beheaded. And if you're going to pick one, I'm going with having my head cut off instantly before I'm going through 4 or 5 days hanging on a tree. Because when it comes to crucifixion in Rome, it wasn't this way for the crucifixion of Christ. They had to get him down off the tree, remember? Because the Sabbath was coming. But in reality, when they would hang somebody on a cross, they could be there for days. And part of them was devoured by birds before they finally succumbed to the crucifixion. So if I'm going to pick one, I'm going with the sword to the neck before I'm going to being nailed up on a tree somewhere. And Paul, as a Roman, could not be crucified. He could not be made to be a gladiator before wild beasts. Thirdly, the first letter to the Corinthians had already been written and sent with Titus before that riot broke out that we were talking about, where they wanted to take Paul to the theater. And they never found Paul anyway. And finally, 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I believe that Paul would have mentioned it here, that had he actually fought with lions, I believe it would have been in this passage of Scripture. Beginning at verse 23. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool, I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods, once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck, a night and a day have I been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, beside those things which are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. I would have thought that had he fought with lions, that would have been in there. Because this letter hadn't been penned yet. And this letter was penned shortly after he left Ephesus and went into Macedonia. So anyway, if you ever stumble across that one, that's my position on that. Or if you're reading 1 Corinthians and bounce across it, now you know where I stand on that. So, we have Paul now finally leaving Ephesus and going into Macedonia for the second time. Acts chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. And after the uproar was ceased, Paul called unto him the disciples and embraced them and departed for to go into Macedonia. And when he had gone over those parts and had given them much exhortation, he came into Greece. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 1. Well, I'm not sure why I wrote that one down. We'll just move on. One of the things that we find, I know why. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 2. One of the things that Paul expected to see when he left Ephesus and headed towards Macedonia, you have to go through Troas to get there. And he expected to run into Titus in Troas. But he couldn't find him there. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. Say, furthermore, when I came to Troas to preach Christ's gospel, and a door was opened unto me of the Lord, I had no rest in my spirit, because I found not Titus my brother, but taking my leave of them, I went from thence into Macedonia. So when Paul left Ephesus, he went to Troas expecting to see Titus. Now remember, he had sent Titus to Corinth with the first letter. So he was expecting to run into him in Troas so that he could find out, well, what happened? How they received the letter? How they receive you? Get an update on what had happened. But he didn't find him there. So he went on into Macedonia. And once in Macedonia, more than likely Philippi, Titus rejoined Paul. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 5 and 6. Where Paul says, for when we were come into Macedonia, our flesh had no rest, but we were troubled on every side. Without were fightings, within were fears. Nevertheless, God that comforteth those that are cast down comforted us by the coming of Titus. So once he gets into Macedonia, now Titus is there, and Titus is able to give him word as to what was going on in Corinth. Now, if we think back a few sermons ago, you'll remember that in the city of Philippi, there was a female convert, the first one that Paul had, by the name of Lydia. And she was a seller of purple, and she owned a pretty good sized house. And it was a place where the apostles were able to stay. You remember that. So it makes sense that when Paul gets back to Philippi, well, she's still there, and he has a place to lodge there where he didn't have in some of these other places. He actually has a place to stay. You'll also remember that Luke had stayed behind in Philippi when Paul went on to Thessalonica. He stayed. Now we're going to see Luke appear here pretty quickly again. But Luke had stayed behind in Philippi. And you'll also remember that one of the reasons that Paul is on this trip is to collect the money that was being raised by the different churches to take to the poor saints in Jerusalem. In 2 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning at verse 13, we read, "Therefore we were comforted in your comfort, yea, and exceedingly the more joyed we for the joy of Titus, because his spirit was refreshed by you all. For if I have boasted anything to him of you, I'm not ashamed. But as we spake all things to you in truth, even so our boasting, which I made before Titus, is found a truth. And his inward affection is more abundant toward you, whilst he remembereth the obedience of you all, how with fear and trembling you received him. I rejoice therefore that I have confidence in you in all things. Moreover, brethren, we do to wit of the grace of God bestowed upon the churches of Macedonia." So he's writing to Corinth, talking about how happy he was with the report that he got back from Titus, and how Titus saw that what Paul had told him about Corinth was the truth. And now he's talking about where he is now in Macedonia. "We do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. For to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power they were willing of themselves, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. And this they did not as we hoped, but first gave their own selves to the Lord and unto us by the will of God." So the churches of Macedonia had given him a great gift to take back to the poor saints in Jerusalem. In fact, there's one passage, it escapes me right now, where he's actually telling them that it's based on what you have, not on what you don't have. In other words, these people were willing to go out and borrow money to give to the poor saints in Jerusalem. They felt, I mean, and when you stop and think about it, the church, they had received the church because of those Jews in Jerusalem. I mean, that's who had sent these guys out, and so they were trying to take care of the poor saints that were there in Jerusalem, that were undergoing persecution and all kinds of trials and afflictions, and they were doing okay, so they were trying to help them. He also mentions in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, he says, "For as touching the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you, for I know the forwardness of your mind, for which I boast of you to them in Macedonia, that Achaia," and remember, Corinth is in the region of Achaia. Achaia is like a county, if you will, or a state. It was one of the 5 city-states, I believe, or one of the areas down in Greece. And Corinth is in Achaia, so when you refer to Corinth, it would be like referring to the brethren in Florida, even though the church is located in Lakeland. Okay? "Boast of you of them of Macedonia that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal hath provoked very many." So he speaks of to the liberality of the saints in Macedonia, and also to those in Corinth having already been ready for him to come. And he then sends Titus to Corinth a second time with that epistle, with the second epistle, which answers some more of the questions that some of those in Corinth had. It's the letter from which we can see that we can get a time frame between the time that the brother was excluded from the church and restored to the church, because in 1 Corinthians, Paul tells him to exclude the man, the one that was having relationships with his stepmother, and in 2 Corinthians, he tells him to restore him. So we can see that time frame, how that goes about. But this is the time when he sends Titus with that. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and verse 16, "But thanks be to God, which put the same earnest care into the heart of Titus for you. For indeed he accepted the exhortation, but being more forward of his own accord, he went unto you. And we have sent with him the brother, whose praise is in the gospel throughout all churches." We don't know who that is. He never mentions who that particular man is. "And not that only, but who was also chosen of the churches to travel with us, with this grace which is administered by us to the glory of the same Lord, in declaration of your ready mind, avoiding this, that no man should blame us in the abundance which is administered by us, provoking for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. And we have sent with them our brother, whom we have oftentimes proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent, upon the great confidence which I have in you. Whether any do inquire of Titus, he is my partner and fellow helper concerning you, or our brethren be inquired of, they are the ministers of the messengers of the churches and the glory of Christ. Wherefore show ye to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf." This is where Paul sends Titus into Corinth with this letter, giving them those very instructions. In chapter 9, verses 3 through 5, it says, "Yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain, in this behalf, that as I said, you may be ready, lest haply, if they of Macedonia come with me, and find you unprepared, we, that we say not ye, should be ashamed in this same confident boasting." In other words, here I've been bragging about you people, and I'm going to come down there and collect that gift. And if I bring people with Macedonia with me, I hope you got it ready, or I'm going to have egg on my face for boasting about how liberal you've been. Therefore I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren that they would go before unto you and make up beforehand your bounty, whereof ye had noticed before, that the same might be ready as a matter of bounty and not of covetousness. So he sends Titus on forward with two other brothers. We don't know who they are. Nowhere are their names mentioned, but he sends them on with this letter, as well as with the instructions to collect the money for the poor saints in Jerusalem, so that when Paul gets down there, it's ready to go. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now, in Acts chapter 20, we just saw this a second ago. In this section of Acts 20 moves really quick. There's parts of this that in one verse you got him going halfway around the world, and then all of a sudden it slows back down again into a crawl for a while, and then it speeds back up again. But in verse 3, and there abode, verse 2, when he had gone over those parts. Well, what are those parts? He goes into Macedonia. What are the parts that he covered in Macedonia? Well, there was a church in Philippi. There was a church in Thessalonica. There were brethren down in Berea. There was a church there. We don't have a letter that was written to them, but we hear of them. So that part, that section known as of Macedonia, there were a number of churches that he'd gone and visited while he was up there, gone over those parts and had given them much exhortation. So he stopped and preached there for a while. Then he went into Greece. Well, that's Corinth. When he goes into Greece, that's Corinth. And there abode 3 months. So he's in Corinth for 3 months. And he spends his time in Corinth with Gaius. Now you remember Gaius. Gaius was one of the guys that was drugged from Ephesus to the theater along with Aristarchus. Okay, and it mentioned Gaius being from Macedonia or Greece in Acts chapter 20, or I'm sorry, Acts chapter 20. Oh, that's where we are, verses 2 through 4. Look at Acts 19:29. The whole city was filled with confusion, and having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. So when Paul gets to Corinth, he stays in the house of Gaius. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 14, where Paul says, I thank God that I baptized none of you, but Crispus and Gaius. Gaius was one of the couple of people that Paul had baptized there in Corinth. And in Romans chapter 16 and verse 23, we read, Gaius mine host, and of the whole church saluteth you. And you'll remember from our study on Romans that Paul wrote the letter to the Romans from Corinth while he was living with Gaius for 3 months. So this is the time when he wrote that letter to the Romans. In Romans chapter 15, verses 25 through 29. We read, "But now I go unto Jerusalem to minister unto the saints." Let's go back a little bit to try to get the context. He had been talking about trying to get to Rome. Now remember, at this time, this is contemporary with where we are right now in our study of Paul. He's in Corinth. He's there for 3 months, and he's writing this letter to Rome, to the church at Rome. He says, "For which cause also I've been much hindered from coming to you, but now having no more place in these parts." He pretty much covered this ground, and if you think about it, he really had. This is his 3rd trip. He'd gone all through that first section around Antioch and all that first, through Antioch of Pisidia and Derbe and Lystra on his first voyage. On his second voyage, he'd gone into Macedonia, founded the churches of Thessalonica, Berea, Corinth, and then sailed back. Now he's back in Corinth. He'd pretty much taken care of all of this area, pretty much as he could. So he says, "But now having no more place in these parts, and having a great desire these many years to come unto you, whensoever I take my journey into Spain, I will come to you, for I trust to see you in my journey, and to be brought on my way thitherward by you, if first I might somewhat be filled with your company." So he wanted to go to Rome and then on to Spain, and he was in Corinth telling the Romans that was his plan. But then he says in verse 25, "But now I go unto Jerusalem to minister unto the saints. For it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. It hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal things. When therefore I have performed this, and have sealed to them this fruit, I will come by you into Spain, and I'm sure that when I come unto you, I shall come in the fullness of the blessing of the gospel of Christ." So this is what he's writing to the Romans from Corinth, which is where we are right now in our study. He's in Corinth writing this letter to the church at Rome. And also in Romans chapter 16 and verse 1, he says, "I commend unto you Phoebe, our sister, which is a servant of the church which is at Cenchrea." Now, Cenchrea is right across the isthmus from Corinth. If you know what an isthmus is, it's a low spot in one of these islands. It's very, very narrow. It's very short distance from Corinth to Cenchrea. So you can get to Cenchrea by water, you can get to Corinth by water, and then you've got this one little band in between them, and one of them's on one sea and one's on the other sea, but it's not a big distance across. So Cenchrea would be the port that you would take to go this direction, and Corinth would be the port to go the other direction. And Phoebe lived in Cenchrea, and she was the one that was going to deliver this letter. In verse 22 of Romans chapter 16, that's where Tertius says that he wrote the epistle. So Paul writes this letter to Corinth, or in Corinth, to the Romans. And if we go back to Acts chapter 20, it had been Paul's intention at this point in Corinth, after spending 3 months there, it was his intention to cross the isthmus to Cenchrea and take a ship to Syria and then go on to Jerusalem. That was his plan. But that plan got thwarted somewhat. We read in verse 3 of Acts chapter 20, and there abode 3 months when he's in Greece. And when the Jews laid wait for him, as he was about to sail into Syria, he purposed to return through Macedonia. You think about a first century man walking around with this bag of gold that he'd collected from all of these churches that he'd been all along the way, and probably a pretty good chunk of money. I don't know what it would have amounted to, but it's probably more than you'd get off of a bum walking down the street. He'd been collecting money from all of these churches, talking about the liberality of him. The Jews don't like him anyway. Well, let's rob him and take his money and kill him. And so once he got word that that was going on, he decided, well, instead of going to Synchrea and putting myself at risk on that, he traveled back up through Macedonia again. He headed back north. And one of the things that we see from the Apostle Paul, and it's interesting, up to a point, the Apostle Paul understood that his ministry was really what was important here. So if there was danger along the way, it didn't mean that he was a coward. It just meant that he was smarter to go the other direction. And he had done it time and time and time again. We're going to see that change here very quickly. We're going to see that that's not going to matter anymore. But as far as this concerned, he had a job to finish. His job to finish did not include getting himself killed. It's hard to finish your ministry when you're dead. So sometimes it makes sense not to get into the battle and go the other direction. You think about the riot where he was willing to go into the theater and the people withstood him and said, don't do it, don't go down there. So he didn't go down there. Think about the number of times that Jesus Christ, where they were going to take Christ and stone him, and Christ slipped away from him. Until you get to the end of the ministry, his mind was, I need to get this collection to Jerusalem, and I can't get it to Jerusalem if I go to Synchrea and get killed. So he went the other direction. And they'd done the same thing once before. When they tricked him, they thought he was going one place and he ended up going to Athens instead. Sometimes that just makes more sense. Now, in verses 4 through 5, we get into something that's kind of interesting here. He decides to return through Macedonia. And verse 4, it says, and there accompanied him into Asia. Okay, so here you have Macedonia, and across the Aegean Sea, you're in Asia. Okay, Ephesus is in Asia. I know I have the map backwards for you, but the way I'm doing this. Ephesus was in Asia. Macedonia is part of Greece. It was that northern section that runs along the Aegean Sea, where Thessalonica and Berea and Philippi and some other areas were. Okay, so he's going back up to Macedonia and then across into Asia. It says, and there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus, and of Asia Tychicus and Trophimus. These going before tarried for us. Now, I mentioned this once before. Notice it's now gone from third person to first person again. We had it was third person up until all of a sudden we run into Luke. And then Luke starts talking about we, us, we. Then it goes back to them and they and them and they. and now it's back to waiting for us. All of these Gentiles here, Sopater of Berea, Aristarchus and Secundus of Thessalonica, Gaius of Derbe, Timotheus, and Tychicus and Trophimus of Asia, all of these Gentiles leave Paul and Luke and go ahead into Troas. They sail across into Troas. And then it says in verse 6, and they wait in Troas for him. In verse 6 it says, and we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. That's Luke and Paul. Luke and Paul left Philippi after the Passover. They stayed in Philippi for the Passover, and then they left and came unto them to Troas in 5 days, where they abode 7 days. So Paul sends all these brethren on to Troas to wait for Luke and Paul, who would travel after the Passover. Now the Passover is a 7-day holiday. You have a Sabbath at the beginning of it, you have a Sabbath at the end of it, and you usually have a Sabbath somewhere in the middle of that. When you think about it, at the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ, there was a Sabbath that was the day that before he was put on the cross, and they had to get him down off the cross for that one. Then a couple of days later, you got another Sabbath, which is the weekly Sabbath, and then comes the first day of the week. Well, that was the Passover. The first day is considered a Sabbath. The last day is considered a Sabbath, and then you've usually got that other one in the middle. It's a 7-day holiday. And so these Gentiles had sailed on while Paul and Luke stayed behind. Now, I know that there are some that actually believe that Luke was Gentile. I do not believe Luke was a Gentile. I believe that Luke was a Jew. He might have been a Hellenized Jew, which means that he had a lot of Greek influence, but I don't believe that he was a Gentile. We see here that he stayed with Paul in Philippi for the Passover rather than going along with all the other Gentiles. He didn't go with them. He stayed back with Luke. Some will say, well, Luke is a Gentile name, so therefore Luke had to be a Gentile. Well, Paul is a Gentile name. Does that make Paul a Gentile? When he changed his name from Saul to Paul, did he become a Gentile? No. There were people that took different names along with him. In Romans chapter 3 and verse 1, Paul says this, what advantage then hath the Jew, or what profit is there of circumcision? Much every way chiefly because that unto them, the Jews, were committed the oracles of God. Scripture was written by Jews, folks. The scriptures were written by Jews. And who wrote the Gospel of Luke? And who wrote the Acts of the Apostles? Luke. And another argument that we're going to see in a few, we won't see it this week, but we'll see it next week. Look over at Acts chapter 21 and verse 28. Now we know that Luke was with Paul he was with Paul in Jerusalem at the time that Paul was arrested. And the reason that Paul was arrested, I'm going to get ahead of myself here a little bit. The reason that Paul was arrested was because they accused him of taking Gentiles into the temple. According to Jewish tradition, you couldn't take Gentiles into certain parts of the temple. If you did, you defiled the temple. And the penalty for defiling the temple in such a way was death. That was what he was charged with. When they hauled him off to Rome, he was being charged with taking Gentiles into the temple. Okay? Now, which I don't believe he did, but that's what they charged him with. I want you to take a look at Acts 21, verses 28 through 30. And see if you can see the name Luke in here anywhere. Crying out, men of Israel, help. This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and yada yada. It's not Luke. It wasn't Luke that they saw in the temple with him. They saw Trophimus, who was an Ephesian, and they believed that that's who it was. Look at Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1. And it came to pass that while he executed the priest's office before God in the order of his course, according to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. And the whole multitude of the people were praying without at the time of incense. And there appeared unto him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And when Zacharias saw him, he was troubled, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said unto him, Fear not, Zacharias, for thy prayer is heard, and thy wife Elizabeth shall bear thee a son, and thou shalt call his name John. And thou shalt have joy and gladness, and many shall rejoice at his birth. For he shall be great in the sight of the Lord, and shall drink neither wine nor strong drink. And he shall be filled with the Holy Ghost even from his mother's womb. And many of the children of Israel shall he turn to the Lord their God, and he shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elias, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make a ready people prepared for the Lord. And when Zacharias said unto the angel, Whereby shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife well stricken in years. And the angel answering said unto him, I am Gabriel, that stand in the presence of God, and am sent to speak unto thee, and to show thee these glad tidings. And behold, thou shalt be dumb, and not be able to speak until the day that these things shall be performed, because thou believest not my words, which shall be fulfilled in their season. That's a pretty intimate knowledge of what went on inside the temple for a Gentile. I find it hard to believe that a Gentile in the first century would know what went on inside the temple in Jerusalem. I just have a hard time believing that. Now, what he's talking about here is that there were priests that were scattered all over Israel. Not all the priests lived in Jerusalem. There were priests that were scattered all over the place. And Zacharias was one of these priests. And so every week there would be a different course that would come to Jerusalem, and they would help the local priests go through the jobs that they had to do at the temple. So you would go down there here for this week, and then you'd go back to your normal job again. And then every so often you end up having to go to Jerusalem. Now there was one of the jobs involved here is laying incense on the altar. He had three guys. The first one would go in and go into the three of you would walk into the temple. The first one would go get all of the old ashes off of the altar and carry them out. The next one would bring coals from the fire outside to put in there so that it's always the same fire, so that you're not... You remember those two guys that got struck down for putting strange fire on the altar? That was the reason for that. So they would continue to put those same coals on, then he would walk out, and then the one whose job it was to lay incense on the altar is now standing in the temple completely by himself. There's no one else in there, just him. And that was Zacharias' job on this particular day when the angel appeared to him. He was the only one inside the temple when the angel appeared to him, and they had this conversation. And one of the interesting things about this is that they drew lots for this job. This was the coveted job to have. Zacharias was an old man and never had had the opportunity to do it. Because once you have the opportunity to do it, your name goes off the list, and you don't get to do it again until everybody else does it. And so here he finally gets his opportunity, and it was on the exact occasion when Zacharias talks to him. But you read through the other Gospels, there's nothing like this in those. They don't get into this kind of detail. And I have a hard time believing that a first century Gentile would have that kind of knowledge. Now, I understand the Holy Spirit can tell anybody that they want to how to write and what words to use, but it just seems odd to me that would be the case. And then you look at you look at Luke's discussion with Mary. Look at Luke chapter 2 and verse 19. After she has been told that she's going to bear this child. And it says, but Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. It appears to me that he had a pretty good knowledge of the folks around Jerusalem at the time that Christ was born. They knew who they were. He could tell things about them. So for those reasons, I believe that Luke was a Jew. I don't believe he was a Gentile. So now Paul sails from Philippi to Troas, and he's accompanied by Luke in Acts chapter 20 and verse 6. And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came unto them to Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. I'm running right up on the clock here. Let me make one real quick point. I'll try to make it quick. It won't be quick. I'll try to make it quick. And then we'll go ahead and break for today. In verse 7 it says, and upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. Now we'll get to the midnight part next week, Lord willing. But the thing I want you to see right now is that this took place on the first day of the week. Sunday, not Saturday. You know, we have people that think that we're still supposed to worship God on the Sabbath. This is a Gentile church, and they met on the first day of the week. That's not the Sabbath. Look at Galatians chapter 4. And remember, Galatia was a church. Paul wrote this letter because the Judaizers were trying to talk them into going under the law. And he tells these Gentiles in Galatians chapter 4, verse 8, howbeit then, when you knew not God, you did service unto them which by nature are no gods, but now, after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? Ye observe days and months and times and years. I'm afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. People that hold to the idea that you can only worship, that you have to worship God on the Sabbath, are falling back into the old Moses law. The fact of the matter is, you can serve God any day of the week. It doesn't matter. If everybody in this church had to work on Sundays, and we got a deal on a room on Wednesdays, and everybody was off on Wednesdays, there's no reason why we can't have church on Wednesdays. So to the Seventh-day Adventists and all of those that say you got to do it on the Sabbath, it's just not true. This church right here, it very clearly says it was on the first day of the week, and that was when they had church, and that's when they had preaching, and that's when they had communion, on the first day of the week. Look at Romans chapter 14. Verse 5. Romans 14 and verse 5. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. Let's see if this is... So these, oh, I lost my place. There we go. The church at Troas met on the first day of the week, and that was when the disciples came together to break bread. Paul preached. He was ready to depart on the next day, and he continued his speech unto midnight. That's where we'll drop off for this week. We'll pick back up here again next week, Lord willing, and we should be able to finish up. We should be able to finish the second trip next week and then move ahead from there. Let's stand and be dismissed in prayer.